So I'd like to welcome everyone to this class event with Dr. Benjamin Fogarty-Valenzuela, entitled Occupations, a Collective Pedagogy of Politics. I am Nicole Rosner. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague today, Dr. Benjamin Fogarty-Valenzuela, who joined the University of Chicago as Mansueto Fellow and Sociology postdoctoral scholar after receiving his PhD in anthropology from Princeton University in 2019. His book project, Pedagogies of Occupation, Free Time, Professionalization, and Protest in Urban Brazil, examines the politics and policing of youth in Brazil. The book addresses the anthropology of policing and incarceration, youth and education, drugs, time, activism, and digital media, and is based on research that has also been published in current anthropology. In a recent event with the New Yorker's John Lee Anderson, he launched the book Art of Captivity, Arte del Cautiverio, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2020. At the University of Chicago, he teaches virtual ethnographic methods and convenes the Chicago Ethnography Incubator. His multimodal work won the 2020 Current Anthropology Visual Anthropology Competition. And in 2021, he became the journal's inaugural visual media editor. He is currently working on a film that chronicles the occupation of a school by a vanguard youth movement in Brazil. Without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. Fogarty-Valenzuela.
Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, each of you who tuned in today. I know that with the arrival of spring and the sort of end of the term, people have a lot on their plates and a lot on their minds. So I trust that whoever made it to this talk today is here out of genuine curiosity in the topic and interest, which lends itself for an even more ripe and rich conversation. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nicole and Natalie, for helping to organize this event. It's been a long time coming with COVID and everything, and I'm really happy to be here with you all and to have the honor of presenting at class here at Chicago. I wanted to just a quick sort of background on the paper you're about to hear. It was written with an anthropology audience in mind, and I'm looking to publish it. And I'm particularly eager to kind of hear the feedback and the responses from an interdisciplinary audience. And I'm hoping that the topic, the sort of main thrust of the presentation can speak to disciplines beyond anthropology, disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, including interdisciplinary spaces such as class and Latin American studies. So, please note that the times that I reference the discipline of anthropology, you could also sort of think of that as a stand-in for a broader conversation about our disciplines and fields more broadly. So I will continue, I'll just jump right into the talk. The summer of 2020 has been compared to the summer of 1968, a moment of grief that gives way to anger, but also hope. In the United States, that moment was sparked not only by a pandemic that killed Black citizens at double the rate of white citizens, but by the impunity of widespread police killings. In response, the movement for Black Lives organized a mass mobilization of unprecedented scale that was often met by more police brutality. Protesters burned police cars and precincts in what the New Yorker's Jelani Cobb declared the American Spring. The uprising spread beyond the United States as well, with actions taking place across the globe from Chile to Lebanon. As the key metaphor of state power, police departments faced literal burning. Other sites were the target of metaphorical burning, the justice system, corporate franchises, and of special significance to this talk, academic disciplines and university departments. 2020 presented itself as a moment of tension with two possible paths forward. a return to business as usual, or a critical break. The discipline of anthropology has often taken the first path. As William Massarella has pointed out in his critique of what he calls the liberal settlement in anthropology, when faced with the opportunity to theorize politics anew, anthropologists have too often fallen back on a defensive reassertions of the old liberal norms and concepts like the Habermasian public sphere and the autonomous liberal humanist subject, or spirited defenses of private property and law and order. Such liberal retreats tend to be especially pronounced on occasions when the people, say a group of citizens protesting police killings, transform into their scary other, the crowd, by burning police cars or destroying private property. A growing cohort of scholars, loosely gathered around the banners of decolonial anthropology and Black studies, have advanced a more pronounced break. The second path, they've argued for the second path. Last summer, in his article, The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn, Sociocultural Anthropology in 2019, Ryan Jobson called for a radical break, becoming the reference point for a discipline-wide discussion over the future of the field. Jobson argues for the need to eschew an exceptionalism that places anthropology outside of its complicity with histories of violence and inequality, and calls for a renewed approach to anthropological theory and method. The consistent falling back into the liberal settlement in times of upheaval, whether that upheaval takes the form of an abolitionist attack on policing or the rise of Trump's fascist politics, demonstrates that the discipline is ill-equipped to describe the realities that many communities, at home or in the field, are facing. Realities that became readily apparent during the summer of 2020. Jobson's provocation, intended as a polemic, was not without its qualifiers. Among them, Abelushi, Ghosh, and Tahir critiqued a US-centric approach, pointing out how the decolonizing work since the 1980s has benefited most from a more internationalist vantage point that anthropology is well positioned to provide. Nevertheless, they converge with Jobson on one point, the need for a controlled burn and making way for new growth. So what happens after the burn? The challenge now is to think seriously about that building anew. My provocation today centers on what it would look like to take another important part of the summer of 2020 uprisings, the urban protest occupations, best captured in the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest, also known as CHOP or CHAZ in Seattle, Washington, but also recent student occupations in Brazil, as a model for anthropology should respond in 2021. Popularized in the US after Occupy Wall Street, and a long-standing form of organized struggle internationally, the occupation has garnered global attention in the last decade. The occupation's rhizomic propagation, hypervisibility, and co-present space of encounter and organizing positions it as a potent mode of radical democracy. In addition, the occupation is a squarely transnational phenomenon, providing it with a vantage point from which to provincialize US-centric approaches. Occupations are a far cry from the metaphorical space of a liberal settlement. Although both settlement and occupation have settler colonial connotations, occupation has been increasingly claimed by social movements, especially in Latin America, to denote, the ways non-powerful people build otherwise worlds squarely within the grips of power. And since 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement has helped center the occupation within global North activist repertoires, providing alternatives to more traditional liberal democratic permit-based street marches. What would an anthropology of occupation, rebuilt on the embers of the liberal settlement, look like? Building on other experimental approaches, collaborative, sensory, decolonial, activist, and multimodal ethnography, I want to suggest today that such an anthropology of occupation would take a cue from a growing cadre of anthropologists doing parallel work informed by social movements. giving a name to the increasing proximity of activism and academic work, and charting a methodological and epistemological way forward for the discipline. This talk makes some proposals as to what that might look like. I highlight how an anthropology of occupation might reorient its methodology in three main ways. First, a collective-oriented approach to research displaces an individualized model. Second, the occupation's horizontal premise sets the stage for collaborative research in which the research encounter is characterized by a multi-directional flow of teaching and learning, softening the boundary between pedagogy and research. And third, a collective, collaborative approach establishes the grounds for political work that exceeds the walls of the field site as well as the university. In engaging in circulation beyond the university's walls, we are well positioned to bring insights from the field back home, to bear upon decolonial and anti-racist work that still needs to be done at the university. While we're still grappling with the immediate aftermath of last summer's protests and spaces like CHOP, the occupation protest in Seattle, I turn to another recent occupation movement that I've dedicated several years to analyzing and understanding from the inside out. This is the high school spring, or the Occupy Everything occupation movement that swept through Brazil and neighboring countries in 2016 and 17, claiming over 1,400 public high schools in order to make demands for infrastructure and quality public education. The movement emerged in the midst of my ongoing research on how Brazilian school systems keep their students in a state of constant busyness. And in response, I extended my analytical frame to encompass these protest occupations. My research took place inside one occupied school, which came to be known as Ocupa Compositor in the neighborhood of Manguinhos, but extended to 15 other such encampments over a period of 8 months, ultimately becoming the subject of 2 chapters and the conclusion of my current book project. First, some context. It might be water rather than fire that my interlocutors have learned to engage most closely over their multi-generational history inhabiting the mangrove shoreline of Rio de Janeiro. The name of their neighborhood, Manguinhos, comes from mangue or mangrove. These trees' submerged roots are resistant to saltwater, tides, floods, and fires. Judging by their recent history, one would conclude that the region's inhabitants, who migrated to occupy the post-colonial industrial edges of Rio, were born of the same tree, inhabiting the urban margins, layer upon layer of occupation, indigenous, colonial, military, industrial, and police, has left its traces on people's lives, but also on the bodies and forms of resistance of young Black residents. My ethnographic work with these collaborators lasted 2 years. My broader book project examines 3 distinct forms of occupation that impinge upon young lives. First, occupation as constant busyness proffered in the name of at-risk youth prevention. Second, occupation as the middle-class fantasy of moralized upright citizenship or a vocation. And this talk focuses on a third form of occupation, one that emerged as a resistance to the first 2 forms, protest occupations. In 2016, water seemed to give way to fire, as the city was infused with unprecedented mega project capital investments on the run-up to Olympic Games. Manguinhos was occupied by dozens of armored vehicles and militarized police, whose mission it was to pacify the city's favelas. Their notoriously violent approach further exacerbated what activists call the genocide of Black youth, otherwise referred to as the war on drugs. Youth from Manguinhos, a neighborhood known as the Gaza Strip for its frequent armed violence, straddle a fine line between the formal and informal economy, faced with a choice of allegiance to the police or to traffickers. The wrong choice can get you killed. The right choice can get you on the right side of a gun barrel. There were 1,814 police killings in 2019 in Rio de Janeiro alone. In Manguinhos, some residents responded to lethal police incursions by linking arms to protect bodies from tampering. others by burning public buses and attacking police stations. It was in that spirit that the grandmother from whom I rented a room during my 2-year research stint concluded that the only solution to ongoing state violence and corruption in the country's political class was to, quote, burn it all down. Her grandson and my central young interlocutor and friend, Mateus, shared her spirit of resistance, but advocated for a somewhat different approach, one predicated on rebuilding after letting burn. The federal government Olympic spending had reached Mateus's favela, but fleetingly. A model school with an Olympic pool was built. But once complete, it promptly lost state-level funding for maintenance and soon began to fall apart. The school, this is Compositor School, the principal dubbed himself the Fireman in reference to the rounds that he made with a screwdriver in hand to quote, resolve the wide-ranging crisis his school faced, from a lack of running water to a cordoned-off staircase. Meanwhile, he saluted school police, providing coffee and water to the same police force that humiliatingly stopped and frisked Mateus one day on his way to school. Viscerally aware of these local and national contradictions, and having exhausted their means for dialogue, Mateus and his fellow schoolmates chose to participate in a student movement that occupied their public high school, alongside another 1,400 schools across the country and continent. He and his fellow schoolmates, motivated by the authoritarianism and racism of their school principal, but also by the dilapidated condition of their school infrastructure, made sets of demands on the state as conditions for their returning the school to the Ministry of Education's control. The school is ours. Come occupy with us, they declared. The occupation, I will suggest, consisted of an act of building up after the fire. It encompassed both the fire and what comes after the burn, a break and the new growth in its wake. What follows is an ethnography of the occupation as a space of burning and rebuilding, and some notes towards an anthropology of occupation. Inspired by the successes of occupation as a method for organizing in the global South, in high school and university settings, and in particular in Brazil's homeless and landless workers movement, I engage these sites as pedagogical spaces, where the foundations of research methods and theorizing can be calibrated by the power and stakes of tried and true horizontal grassroots organizing. Such an approach also makes room for regional and comparative insights that can contribute to, for example, a discussion on decolonizing academia back home. Theorizing an anthropology of occupation, I ask what ethnography would look like if it were guided by the principles and practices of the aforementioned occupations. Picking out 3 particular characteristics of occupations: the occupation as a site of collective social organizing, occupation as a site of collaborative pedagogy, and occupation as a site of political action, I show how they manifested in Ocupa Compositor and how they'll provide resources for anthropologists invested in reimagining the discipline in 2021. Ethnographers enter a space that is not their own and overstay their visit, leaving only when they have acquired something, whether that's knowledge, information, or data, etc. Similarly, an occupation is a march that enters a space and overstays its visit, leaving only when it has acquired something, when its demands have been met, when it has achieved rights, negotiation, or visibility, for example. Yet while both occupy a space, one key difference between the two, occupiers and ethnographers, is that ethnographers roam alone, often serving their and their institution's own ends, whereas occupiers act as part of collectives that serve the rather urgent needs of the individuals occupying, as well as public and local stakeholders. This observation isn't a call to collapse these two undertakings, research and protest. Rather, it is an observation that the ever-present ethical lapses that ethnographers are often trained to normalize. Ethnographers are trained to serve their own ends, justifying such myopia with the ideological discourse of neutral observation. In theorizing an anthropology of occupation, I'm interested instead in understanding the ethnographer as both an individual with their own critical awareness, positionality, and skill set, and a member of an occupying collective, making them ethically accountable to a group. Rather than understanding such collective accountability as a threat to ethnographic authority, my interest is in what the ethnographer stands to gain from such a collectivist rather than an individualist approach. At the institutional level, such a reorientation might disrupt the way we understand individual reward-based systems in academia, such as promotion, lone authorship, and teaching. Building upon the collaborative work of critique and research sharing that various other disciplines, including some in the sciences, engage in. But here, I want to focus on two theoretical consequences of this shift in framework. First, through becoming part of an occupying collective, though becoming part of an occupying collective mitigates individualism, it notably still leaves space for individuality. And second, becoming part of the collective is a process that has not just intellectual, but also sensory consequences. Placing one's body in the service of collective thinking and learning, therefore expands the scope and nuances of one's observations. During my 2 months as a researcher and member of an occupation collective in a Rio de Janeiro public high school, I saw firsthand how the occupation, as a space of organizing, is organized around the imperative to fend off the more individualistic drives of its members, while also actively bridging individual and collective needs. This insight became readily apparent at moments of entering and exiting the school occupation. Through my time inside, I realized my individualistic approach to research not only bordered on unethical, it also diminished the breadth of my observations. The occupation prompted me to slowly remold my approach so as to fit more organically within its rhythms and affects. I had spent a weekend without visiting the occupation, and upon returning one day, I was greeted by a friend and member of Ocupa Compositor. We were passing each other in the hallway when he said, "Tá sumido, Benjamin. Saudades. You've been disappeared, Benjamin. We missed you." Or "Where were you?" Two others made similar comments that day. And I was struck by their spontaneous way of expressing affection and care, showing that they had noticed my absence and welcoming me back. Similarly, when walking around the school while wearing my backpack in the afternoon, students frequently anticipated my departure, asking, "Já vai embora? Are you already leaving?" Their assumption was that carrying my backpack around, rather than putting it together with others' belongings in the living quarters, signaled my intent to leave. So these gestures of welcoming me back and seeing me off did two things. First, they made me notice students' awareness of moments in which I behaved individualistically, disconnecting from the occupation for days, often to continue fieldwork elsewhere. At the same time, they graciously acknowledged that I had individual needs beyond the occupation, just like many of them who had caregiving and work responsibilities with family, making me feel welcomed back, appreciated, and needed, and adding to a sense of solidarity and group belonging in the occupation. This example shows how occupation as method short circuits the ethnographer's long-held individualism, displacing an extractivist propensity for the practice of inhabiting the field as a shared space. This marking of entrances and exits was only made possible by the premise of the occupation, one of co-presence and co-inhabiting. The condition of being there together pushes the individual to refashion oneself into part of the collective. Central to this balance between the individual and the collective is the daily horizontal assembly that's characteristic of the occupation, during which individuals from various commissions or working groups come together to resolve conflicts and define priorities. This process also helps prompt the ethnographer to balance their individual identity and their role as part of the collective. Over time, I grew tired of the daily assemblies and I began to skip them. And I would soon come to see how my absences had gradually put me at odds with the occupying students' sense of priorities for the occupation. One day, after returning from a weekend away, I learned that one of the top priorities for the collective was to empty, clean, and restore the school's defunct swimming pool. Inaugurated with great fanfare as an Olympic pool prior to the 2016 Games, the pool soon fell into disrepair due to a lack of maintenance funds. Initially, I dismissed the emphasis on the pool as superfluous, given the urgency of meeting other needs. What I had missed in my absence was that the pool was a priority for those present at a collective sensory level. They loathed the sight and smell of the rotting pool and the brown water. And to them, converting it into a clean, attractive space of leisure was top priority. As I began to attend regular assemblies, during which the pool came up repeatedly, I slowly came to share their preoccupations. This prompted me to extend the scope of my inquiry. As I began to focus on the narrative surrounding the pool, I was able to see its tremendous symbolic importance to the occupation and to the wider community. It was only by virtue of co-inhabiting with the group over time, at an intellectual but also at a sensory level, that I was alerted to the ethnographic salience of the pool. These episodes of sensory experience informing political demands provide another important lesson for the ethnographer, that occupation as method requires far more than a notebook and an audio recorder. Rather, it means placing one's body in service of collective thinking and learning. Far more than needing food, water, and a place to sleep, what I observed inside the occupation was a much broader craving, or set of needs, if you will, among occupiers, best articulated through the language of the senses, or sensory needs. Through co-present and quotidian sensing of space over time, occupiers engaged in a uniquely collective sort of inquiry and organization. Smells called for cleaning, heat called for air conditioning, the taste of snacks called for the cooking of meals, and quiet called for making music. When occupying together with others, the ethnographer becomes far more than one person seeking to meet their unique set of needs. Rather, she becomes sensorially co-present and part and parcel of the effort to maintain and transform a shared space into something pleasant to the ear, kind to the nose, inviting to the eye. These essential efforts to satisfy shared wants at an intimate and embodied level position the ethnographer as part of a collective form of engaged care and well-being. To fellow occupiers, I was no longer seen as a professor or gringo, and I soon became a fellow ocupa. The occupation ushered in more than a new collective-oriented way of being. It also generated new ways of knowing. In toppling the school's hierarchy, it upended a way of producing knowledge. So part 2 of this talk explores the pedagogical potential of an anthropology of occupation. In short, I want to suggest that a pedagogy of occupation is one that creates and transmits knowledge in a collaborative, pluralistic manner. To the students, it was the principal, a self-proclaimed fireman, who represented the antithesis to all these possibilities. In many respects, they were right. A former member of the military, he spoke to students condescendingly, and he was afraid of what he called the radical changes that an organized student body could bring about to his own way of putting out fires at the school. He was fixated on due process, and the school's worsening financial and infrastructural problems only entrenched him further in his ways, emphasizing graduation rates and test scores. His teaching style dovetailed with his authoritarian ways, embodying his theory of how knowledge is transmitted. Students copied down notes from a whiteboard while he spoke at them through a loudspeaker and a headset. His hierarchical and unidirectional teaching was an instance of what Paulo Freire calls banking education, where teachers, as the sole keepers of knowledge, deposit education and information into students' empty heads. By contrast, students were upset that their principal preferred to snuff out small fires in his administration, turning a blind eye to the fact that the school's budget had been cut in half by the Ministry of Education. They understood his approach was a flagrant perpetuation of structural injustices. Sure, their high school degrees were within arm's reach, but through the occupation, they had their eyes set on something else entirely, attaining their collective emancipation by revealing the structural injustices, those structural injustices through pedagogy. Prioritizing collective pedagogy rather than individual career advancement, their approach fits squarely within the pedagogical tradition of collaborative knowledge creation. As the principal made his way out of the gates at the outset of the occupation, students erupted in cheers. The demands they made shortly thereafter to the Secretary of Education spoke out, quote, against the principal's oppression and called for, quote, the removal of police from the school. These two negative demands were their way of burning down, seeking to bring an end to the principal's control. Of crucial importance, though, was the pedagogy that Okupas instituted in place of the authoritarian pedagogical space the principal had maintained. Demands for, quote, class in a free space, by which they meant a classroom free of oppressive rules and punishments, and the, quote, direct election of the principal. The demands were aligned with the pedagogy of occupation they put forth. The occupation brought an end to the days of regimented whiteboard lessons to be copied down for the test. Occupation pedagogy had two main characteristics, both of which flowed directly into my ethnographic research design. First one is that it was collaborative. The encampment itself, like dozens of others across the city and country, had an open doors policy, welcoming local residents and visitors who brought donations and shared their knowledge through teach-ins. Students attended teach-ins, offered visitors meals often, cooked in the school kitchen, and took them on guided tours of their occupation encampment. Second, occupation pedagogy was multimodal or predicated on multimedia uses. Long texts and manifestos fell short of the kind of affective and urgent messages they sent out via online platforms. Put another way, their pedagogy built upon text-based argumentation, introducing sound, photo, film, and spoken word into their communicative registers and strategies. For a pedagogy that reached their community of Manguinhos, people must be met where they are, and that place the Okupas knew better than anyone is squarely multimodal. Taking an anthropology of occupation seriously then means a pedagogy built on collaboration and multimodality. It also means understanding that the research encounter is a fundamentally pedagogical one, predicated on collaborating with others to disseminate knowledge. This is to say that an anthropology of occupation entails a vivid awareness of the high stakes political project that takes place within inside educational spaces, but also spaces where research is carried out. Insights on racism, power, and inequality from other disciplines and interdisciplinary fields can be brought to bear in a rigorous and disciplined manner on the university campus. Members of the occupation understood that describing their problems and demands did not suffice. Rather, their political mobilization hinged on circulating beyond the school proper. An anthropology of occupation would therefore go beyond describing the world to itself. Instead, it would be geared towards entering and changing the world, entailing a keen awareness of the kind of circulation and organizing necessary to make that knowledge operative beyond the walls of an educational institution. One of the occupation's demands in particular expressed the political potential of the movement, the demand for the reintegration of the school with the community. Using the collectively built space of the encampment and its pedagogy as a nexus or a staging ground, students enthusiastically circulated within their community, but also through the city as a whole, including the streets, the governor's palace, and the Secretary of Education in Rio de Janeiro's affluent Zona Sul. Their work of integrating meant making their bodies and educational demands visible in spaces of power. Occupiers understood that in order to achieve their first demand, the demand for infrastructure, they would have to carry out their desire for the other demand, the demand of reintegration. Such circulation beyond the walls of the school was not only more exciting than the teach-ins, which often fell short of the energy of the streets, but it was central to the political work necessary to pressure the Secretary of Education to meet their demands. Occupying students circulated Rio de Janeiro by foot, and when they had cash, by bus, and they were often invited to speak at other sites of social protest. Circulating beyond the school as a commitment took two main forms. First, the Ocupas traveled to other public schools for the purposes of movement building. Their idea was to gain strength in numbers, and therefore their goal was to organize students at other schools, other institutions, providing them with the excitement and information necessary for them to convert their school into another occupation. Compositor was the 17th of an estimated 85 occupied schools in Rio de Janeiro. Alongside other members of occupied schools in Rio, Ocupa Amaro, Ocupa Pedro II, Ocupa Paulo Freire, the Compositor Ocupas organized movement-wide meetings that rotated from school to school. They also circulated to the state headquarters of the Secretary of Education in Rio, as you can see in this picture, protesting and eventually occupying it for over 2 weeks. The second is that they attended public marches, rallies, slam sessions, fundraising, and artistic interventions. They considered these activities a priority due to their public visibility. By circulating and staging visible protests in key spaces of power, the symbolically charged spaces of protests, such as the Secretary of Education in downtown city streets, they were enhancing the power of their demands. But such activities were also valuable because they were fun. Meeting other students, sharing stories, and going on outings were valued. In the circulation that I observed, it was evident that occupiers weren't satisfied with transforming their school spaces and the pedagogy therein alone. Rather, they understood that the possibility of enduring transformation, both personal and political, can only be secured by extending beyond the walls of their school, circulating the city in order to organize in various social milieus and institutions, with the ultimate goal of having their demands met. Occupations are frequently understood as tied to one place. The practice of circulating outside an occupied territory, coordinating with other occupations, changes our understanding of what the occupation as a political form is. An occupation in this analysis looks more like an expansive network tied together through nodes, each organized by collectives that generate collaborative actions. Taking a cue from the Ocupas, who knew that describing their ills would not suffice, an anthropology of occupation goes beyond understanding the world it describes from within a university setting. Instead, predicated on an ethics and method of collaborative circulation of ideas, collectives, and resources, it enters and re-enters the world it describes time and again. Ocupas knew that their demands would not be met without extending beyond, through, and within their protest encampments. Likewise, an anthropology of occupation understands that the tracing of new routes and new destinations for the products of university research does not occur on its own. In building up after the burn, an anthropology of occupation harbors possibilities for a personhood, pedagogy, and politics capable of responding to the times. Possibilities that this talk has highlighted through the examples of the occupations that flourished in Brazil in 2016 and those in the US in 2020. The anthropology of occupation presents a path forward premised on commitments to collectivity as opposed to individualism, collaborative pedagogy as opposed to banking education, and an embrace of the inherently political stakes of education by way of circulation. An anthropology of occupation, hence, entails reformulating the role that the academic researcher plays in society. and further, the role of the university. It is no surprise then that such a project might help put a name to, and crucially, establish a methodological and ethical grounding for the increasing proximity between scholarship and activism evident across the humanities and social sciences. In addition, it might bring forth a comparative approach grounded in global South practices, contributing to discussions on decolonial and anti-racist universities in the global North. While I've given you a sense of what this looks like in my own work, I want to close by gesturing outwards to two research projects by other scholars who I see as doing parallel work. And I close with these other scholars' work rather than my own in order to emphasize that the anthropology of occupation, as I understand it, is a collective endeavor. Savannah Shangay's 2019 book, Progressive Dystopia, is an ethnography that excavates the anti-Black practices that manifest even in the most progressive of high schools in San Francisco. Shangay builds a case for an abolitionist anthropology that sets as its premise not reformism, like the Fireman approach of Compositor's principle, but rather an ambitious project of imagining futures of collective liberation beyond the confines of what she calls a multi-sided anti-Black state. Her abolitionist premise, however, does not preclude working, quote, within, against, and beyond the state. She delivers a provocation to, quote, care more than we can know, to extend our analysis past the ruins of the world and the discipline as we know it. This call for a mode of reparative care finds an echo in the collective and collaborative ethos of the Ocupa encampments. Her book forms part of a growing literature on abolitionist scholarship, the anthropology of education, and Black studies more broadly, and is not merely concerned with describing the world as it is, but with building the world as it should be. In their introduction to the American Anthropologists' Multimodal Anthropology Special Series, Dattatreyan and Marrero Guillermon articulate a line of flight, or what they call a line of flight for an anthropology yet to come. They theorize the possibilities that emerge when anthropologists use a combination of audio, video, text, still images, performance methodologies, and web platforms to collaboratively and centrally generate relations with research participants and audiences. Their concern is with the centrality of media production in the everyday life of both the anthropologists and their interlocutors, but also with the potential of these media-rich worlds for rethinking anthropological practice. By inhabiting these media ecologies, not only can we move beyond a strictly text-based forms of authorship, representation, and publishing, we can also create a plurality of ways of knowing and learning together. Like the Ocupa's multimodal approach to pedagogy and to making demands, such a plurality raises the possibility of another anthropology, one that is, quote, more public, more collaborative, more political. An expansive approach to what was once called visual anthropology, multimodal anthropology sits at the intersection of critical pedagogy, the anthropology of digitalization, and media studies. The Ocupas, Shangay, and Dattatreyan and Marrero Guillermon are all similarly invested in unsettling the tacit settlement that lets some lives continue to matter less than others. They point beyond the complacency of the liberal settlement and towards, instead, what I've called today the occupation, as that which enacts new conditions of possibility, of thought, and of being together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Benji. This was such a wonderful discussion and talk. And I think I want to thank Natalie and Lindsay for organizing the event as well. And we can all give you guys a round of applause. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Likewise, thanks for coming. Thanks for hosting, Nicole.
Bye, you guys.
Bye-bye.